I think one of the most interesting things about grief is that it's full of contradictions. It's one of the most universal experiences we will ever have. Every one of us at some point will encounter it. And yet it is also one of the most individual and deeply personal. No two people grieve in quite the same way. Every loss is different, every relationship is different, and every story is different. And because of that, every experience of grief is different too. For a long time, we've come to expect grief as though it follows a predictable path, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Something that we move through until eventually we arrive at acceptance and life somehow returns to normal. But actually, I don't think that's how grief works. From my own experience and from witnessing so many others in theirs, grief feels far more fluid. It has a rhythm, and sometimes an unpredictable one. Some days it arrives quietly, gently touching the edges of our lives, and other days it crashes over us with such force that it takes our breath away and leaves us wondering how something we thought we had learnt to live with can suddenly feel so overwhelming again. Grief isn't something we experience once. It moves, it shifts, it changes shape. And perhaps that's because grief itself is never just one thing. It can be sadness, relief, anger. It can feel like hope, confusion, despair and exhaustion, and sometimes all within the same moment. It asks us to hold emotions that don't always make sense together, yet somehow belong together all at the same time. People often think grief is only about the person, relationship, or life we've lost, but grief rarely arrives alone. Alongside the primary loss often come so many secondary losses that can consciously go unnoticed. The loss of uncertainty and routine, the loss of a future we imagined, the loss of identity and roles that we once held, the loss of feeling like ourselves. Because grief doesn't just change our circumstances, it changes us. Sometimes it asks us to become someone we never expected to have become. And perhaps that's one of the hardest parts. Not simply learning how to live without what we've lost, but learning who we are now without it. I also wonder whether one of the greatest difficulties we face isn't just grief itself, but the expectations we carry about what grief is supposed to look like. Many of us have grown up believing that grief comes in stages, that if we move through those stages in the right order, eventually we'll reach acceptance and everything will begin to feel okay again. But what happens when our experience doesn't look like that? What happens when we're doing well for weeks or months, and then something as simple as a smell, a song, a photograph, or a familiar place suddenly brings everything flooding back? We begin asking ourselves painful questions like, why am I still struggling? I thought I dealt with this, or shouldn't I be over this by now? Sometimes the suffering isn't only in the grief, it's in believing we're grieving incorrectly, that somehow we're failing at something that has no single path. And with that can come guilt, shame, self-judgment and anxiety. Not only are we carrying the weight of our loss, we're now carrying the weight of believing we should be carrying it differently. And that can make everything feel so much heavier. I often think one of the kindest things we can do is to let go of the idea that there is a right way to grieve. Because grief isn't something to succeed or fail at. It isn't a timetable to keep or something to compare ourselves to. It's a deeply human response to loving, losing, and living. Perhaps another reason grief can feel so lonely is that we still don't always know how to talk about it. As a culture, we're often far more comfortable with solutions than we are with sorrow. When someone is grieving, we instinctively want to make it better. We search for the right words, the right advice, the right way to help, and yet grief has a way of humbling us. Because sometimes there are no words that can make it better. Sometimes there is nothing to fix. Perhaps grief isn't asking to be solved. Perhaps it's asking to be witnessed, to be sat alongside, to have someone acknowledge that this is hard, without trying to rush us somewhere else. I wonder if that's why grief can sometimes feel so isolating, Not because we're completely alone, but because we can begin to feel as though our grief is too much, too uncomfortable, too inconvenient, too long. We notice the conversations become quieter, the messages becoming less frequent, the world continuing to move while ours has stood still. And sometimes, in an attempt to protect the people around us, we begin to hide it. We speak about it less, we cry in private, we reassure everyone else that we're doing okay, and not because we are, but because we worry our grief has become too difficult to witness. I think one of the most healing experiences we can have is to discover that we don't have to carry it alone, to find a space where we don't need to minimise it, where we don't need to explain it away or make it more comfortable for someone else, a space where every emotion is invited, where every contradiction belongs, where grief doesn't have to be hidden, only held. People often ask me when grief ends, and I've come to think that we could be asking another question, because I don't know that grief is something we're meant to get over. I think it's something we slowly learn to live alongside. I think it's actually something we learn to carry, something we grow around. Not necessarily because it becomes smaller, but because over time our capacity to hold it begins to grow. I think this is where therapy can help, not by taking grief away or asking us to move on, and not by teaching us how to grieve correctly. Instead, I think therapy offers something much gentler, a place to put the weight down for a while, a place where every part of our experience is welcome, where we don't have to explain why today's wave feels bigger than yesterday's, where we don't have to justify while we're still hurting, where we can begin to understand not only our grief, but ourselves within it. Because grief doesn't only live in our thoughts, it lives in our bodies, our nervous systems, our identities, our beliefs about ourselves and the world. Healing then isn't about learning how to stop the waves. I don't think any of us can do that. Healing is learning what to do when they arrive, learning how to recognise them sooner, how to steady ourselves, how to regulate ourselves when everything feels overwhelming, how to breathe when we feel as though we're being pulled beneath the surface, how to ask for help before we're drowning, and how to trust that this feeling, however painful, will not last forever. I often think that grief reorganises our internal world as well as our external one. It changes the way that we experience time. It changes our relationships and the way we love. It can change our priorities, our idea of faith, and how we understand ourselves. Healing isn't simply recovering. Sometimes it's becoming. Perhaps that's why I don't see grief as something to overcome. I see it as one of life's deepest thresholds, a place between who we were and who we're becoming. A place that asks us to make sense of a life that no longer looks and feels the way we imagined. The ocean never promises calm. It simply keeps moving. Perhaps we're not so different. Perhaps healing isn't arriving at a place where grief can no longer find us. Perhaps it's discovering that we are no longer afraid of the tide, that we trust ourselves to meet it, because the waves never stop coming, but slowly, patiently, compassionately, we discover that we are becoming someone who knows how to stand in it, not because grief has disappeared, but because we've learned how to hold it.